And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. One of those attention-getting banners came across my television screen the other night. It read, "Americans lose sleep due to stress around the world." Do you lose sleep due to stress about the world? I do sometimes. I think Jeremiah lost sleep to the stress in his world. It is hard to tell whose voices are speaking in today's Jeremiah lesson, but one thing is for sure, they are speaking words of lament. And God's voice is one of those lamenting voices. Why? Because Israel's future looked so bleak. It sounds as if the psalmist of today's lesson is losing sleep too. "Oh God," he says, "the heathen have profaned your holy temple and made Jerusalem a heap of rubble." If the psalmist were writing today, his lament would certainly include Ukraine. It's amazing how scriptures hold up even for today. But how about the manager in Jesus' parable? Do you think he lost any sleep after finding out that his boss was on to him? After finding out he was being fired? Now the story sounds as if the manager came up with an instantaneous solution to his problem. I doubt it. When someone finds out that their personal world is going up in flames, it is hard to make any decisions at all. I can see the manager lying awake hours and hours trying to figure out what to do next, how to save himself. There are many times in my life when I've laid awake with the events of the day going around in my head, and I see somebody nodding. It's sort of a human condition, isn't it? But this was particularly true when I was in charge of a congregation. I wished I had a key that would turn my brain off when I got in bed at night. By the way, that's one of the good things about my position at St. Bartholomew's now. I'm not in charge anymore. And when things go crazy, I just look at Flo Ledyard and I say, "You're the rector." And then I smile. And that's one of the reasons Gray needs the sabbatical. But sometimes I lay awake stressing over what's going on in the world. The good news is I've learned that I can turn it off, not with a key, but by turning over whatever it is to God, at least for the night. I go to sleep praying that God will give me new insights in the morning, new ways of dealing with it. And you know what? Often I'm given that gift. It may not be the end-all solution or action, but it's enough for me to move forward. God is indeed good. But I want us to go a little deeper into the story of the dishonest manager. Is there anything we can learn from it that will help us when we are faced with difficult and stressful things? As I said, I see, it's a story, so you can look at it however your eyes see it. But I see the manager tossing and turning in his bed after he gets the news that he's been fired. One thought after another goes through his head, but he acknowledges two things, and this is important. He was not strong enough for hard labor, and he was too proud to beg. Being honest with ourselves is a necessary step to be able to move on. I bet he even said a little prayer asking for God's help. And indeed, the manager received that aha moment. After all his years of dealing with people, with debtors in particular, it paid off. He figured that if he could ingratiate himself to some of them, maybe they would at least give him a roof over his head and food for his belly. Now, as you heard, the owner of the business, the master, had ordered the manager to give a complete accounting on his way out the door. The owner wanted to know how he had been cheated and by how much. He wanted to see the damage that the manager had done. Maybe he should bring some legal charges against him. Maybe he himself had some disputes he needed to mend. When you think about it, this story keeps repeating itself, doesn't it? All we have to do is look around us today to see bad management, even in high places. We hear about fabricated paper trails, personal expenses written off to governments or companies, bills not paid for work done, and we hear about all kinds of schemes to cover it all up. The manager in today's story knew he could not cover it up. So he came up with a plan that might just get him off a little easier. He would reduce the amounts owed by the debtors by subtracting probably the amount he has added on for his commission. And for some, as you heard, that amount must have been exorbitant. You see, the manager wasn't just a squanderer, he was guilty of usury. The poor debtors were ecstatic to find out their exorbitant debts were reduced. They probably went to bed thanking God for making their lives easier, kind of like the student loan thing these days. With debts as large as theirs, they would have never gotten out from under. And this would be a huge help. But now we come to the part of the story that astounds us, the part that makes us stop and think and wonder, the part that troubles us and yet sort of makes us chuckle. Now we come to the part where the master commends the dishonest manager. Why would he commend him? Now the master has even less money than he thought. He certainly wasn't pleased with the manager. The manager cheated people, especially the poor. It made him look bad too. I don't really like that manager in this story. Do you like him? Do you think Jesus' audience liked him? Did Jesus like him? Did the debtors like him? Did the rich owner like him? I don't think so. Now, many commentators, biblical commentators, believe that the rich owner's commendation of the manager was the end of the story. That's where it stopped. And that Luke added all the rest. That Luke gathered together a bunch of Jesus' sayings about wealth and tacked them on at the end. And if you read it, that makes a lot of sense. There are some commentators that believe verses 8 and 9 are part of this original story. And I, in fact, like that best, especially after I read Eugene Peterson's contemporary translation called The Message. Maybe you're familiar with it. Let me read to you what he says. It starts with verse 8. Now here's a surprise. The master praised the crooked manager. And why? Because the manager knew how to look after himself. Streetwise people are smarter in this regard than law-abiding citizens. They are on constant alert, looking for angles, surviving by their wits. I want you, now Jesus is talking to the disciples, to be smart in the same way, but for what is right, using every adversity to stimulate you to creative survival. Well, I like that translation because it helps me to look at the story. I like it because it challenges us to be creative in responding to whatever is keeping us awake at night, whatever is causing us stress. It challenges us to boil things down to what we can do and what we can't do. And it challenges us to use our street smarts. I really like that for this passage. And by that I mean whatever we have learned on the streets of our lives, whether they be out there on the literal streets or the places where we live and work and hang out. This is especially important for us as a church. We are both set apart and immersed in the world. We are the church wherever we are, but we are never just about saving our own necks. We're about bringing in the kingdom, making sure everyone has a roof over their head, food for their bellies, and a community that cares about them. One of my favorite examples of somebody with street smarts, I think of it that way, is the founder of the DC Central Kitchen. I was the interim rector at Grace Georgetown in Washington in the late 1980s. Robert Edgar was a parishioner. He was also a chef. Slowly, he came up with this, or God gave him, I think, this great aha moment. And he said, why can't we collect leftover food from hotels and merchants, take it to a central kitchen, teach homeless people to remake it into casseroles, and then feed homeless people and poor people? Robert used his street smarts, things he'd learned on the job, things he saw in Georgetown, wherever, to come up with this and to accomplish it because he had a community. He did an amazing thing that spread beyond the city of Washington. One other small example is a woman I had in my parish at Holy Apostles in Arbutus. Her name was Bonnie Clendaniel. She was the founder of a national swim program that they use in the YMCAs around the country for people with MS. Bonnie used her street sense, her street smarts, that she gained through her own experience of going swimming with MS, and also with other people with MS that she met at the Catonsville Y. The program, again, spread to other Ys across the country. Jesus was a great storyteller. There is never just one point to get from his stories. They are all just waiting for us to think about them and massage them. So before we leave the story, I want to add another thing that I would like to point out about it. By telling this story, I think Jesus wanted us to know that God does not give up on any of us. We're all flawed, or as Paul would say, we're all sinners. But we all have creative genes that can be used for the kingdom. We all have street smarts in one way or another. So, instead of tossing and losing sleep, We need to put our stress in God's hand for the night. And then we need to gather with each other and put on our creative caps. What street smarts do we bring together that may be put to good use for God's kingdom? What we can't come up with may not be the end-all solution to problems of our neighborhoods or our world or even for ourselves. Maybe it'll only make a small dent, but we will have been faithful and honest, and we will have moved God's kingdom a bit further into the world. Amen.